It did not allow blood vessel development. So if it was taken at the wrong time, babies would not have grown at all. They simply would have died. So when I tell people that I was born without arms because of thalidomide, I don't think that's sad. I just think I'm lucky I made it, you know? Because I could have died too. When I was born, I was put in intensive care. I was stuck in an incubator. I was even given last rites by a priest. And I'm not saying this to be melodramatic. These are facts. The doctors, in fact, were secretly hoping that I might even die. Because what would my life be like? Well, obviously I didn't die. In fact, 5 days later, I started to get better. In fact, at that point, my family met me for the first time. They had not even seen me before. They did not know anything. The doctors did not want to cause any undue concern for them. So I wish I could tell you when I met my family for the first time that it was a beautiful, tender moment, but it wasn't. Within about an hour or so, I was given up for adoption. Now again, this is just stuff that you need to know about me. You can appreciate that a lot of people think that's sad as well. I don't either. In fact, you know what? I don't think I ever questioned why I would be given up for adoption. I remember the first time I asked about it, though. I was about 6 years old. And my mom told me that I asked her a very honest question, which of course young children tend to do. I looked at her one day and I said, "How come you're so old?" Now, in this context, she really was quite elderly compared to my friend's parents, for example, all right? And I said, "And how come your skin's so wrinkled?" And she goes, "Well, Alvin, I'm going to tell you a story. We did not give birth to you. We simply took you home from the hospital because your family couldn't take care of you." So then I heard the story for the first time, of which I'd like to relate for you tonight again, for those of you that heard this before. I know it's a bit redundant, but if you've not heard it, this is so important. Can you imagine what it would have been like when I was left in that hospital? The chances were not good that I would go home with anybody, okay? And I know this is a long time ago, but, you know, I mean, let me ask you another sort of important question, and this isn't a fair question, because the answer might be obvious, but it's an honest question. Would you take a baby like me home? See, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because I don't know if I would, all right? I really don't know how I'd feel about that, but I remember this story like I heard it a million times, of how Hilda and Jack Law, my potential parents, were foster parents. They lived in Yorkton. They had a foster home. They looked after primarily teenagers with problems. In fact, specifically a lot of young teenagers who had found themselves pregnant, who, of course, at that time, most of society wanted to get rid of. Jack and Hilda Law had compassion. They would look after these children. They had a way about them. They were a little on the experienced side. They were in their mid-50s when we first met. They were married in 1930. They raised their 2 sons during the 1930s and 40s. So by 1959, when they moved to Yorkton, they were lonely. That's why they took in children. They got a phone call one day. Hilda did, in fact. And the phone call went like this. "Mrs. Law, my name is Margaret Sherrick. I'm a social worker at the hospital here. I'm also a nurse. Can I talk to you for a little bit?" "Sure." "Mrs. Law, I understand you have a foster home." "Yes, we do. And we have a child here that doesn't have a home. Do you think you would be willing to look after a child at this time?" "Well, we've got a couple living here right now, but we can always take one more." "Well, what's the problem?" "Well, he's a newborn, Mrs. Law, and he doesn't have a home." "Well, what's the problem?" "Well, Mrs. Law, we really can't tell you over the phone, but would you mind coming up and maybe meeting him to see if you'd be really interested?" So, of course, she became very curious herself. What could be wrong with this child who would not want a newborn? So, the story has it that the following Saturday, she took her husband, Jack, up to the hospital. They came into my room. I was under a blanket. They still knew no details. The nurse came over, picked me up, handed me to Hilda, who uncovered my blanket and saw my reality. Of course, everyone does. Looked and stared at my having no arms, but she always talked about this. Her eyes very quickly drifted to my eyes. Apparently they met. Somehow she knew they were meant to be together. You know how moms get, right? She looked at Jack and she said, "This is the ugliest baby I've ever seen. Just look at him. No wonder nobody wanted him. We should take him home." Now, apparently Jack didn't want to have anything to do with this, okay? But Jack was under a bit of an illusion. An illusion I think a lot of men are under if they were really honest with themselves. He thought he was the boss. So, Hilda got her way, and they took me home. Now that alone is a wonderful speaker story, isn't it? A kind of a nice, warm, fuzzy story. That's not why I'm telling you. I want to ask you again. Could you imagine the kind of person that would take home a baby like me? Because let's be honest about this too. I was going to be a bit high maintenance, wasn't I? And you can imagine, all of the other things that might go with this. Just even the philosophy alone. Could you imagine how it must have felt? Especially when the doctors, and again, I'm not making this up, told Mrs. Law, don't have any expectations for this child. No matter how long he happens to stay with you, he will never be able to do anything like other children. He will be dependent on you for the rest of his life. Have no expectations. So that was an important mindset, don't you think? I'll talk about that in a minute. Mom always liked to talk about the practical stuff, when everyone tried to get her into a deep conversation about the philosophical value of a disabled child. She would often talk about, it was the other stuff that was just weird. Wouldn't it be weird looking after a baby without arms? I mean, the little things, like, how do we pick up a baby, for example? Usually by the arms, right? Well, I dropped a lot, so they had to figure that one out. And then, this one in particular seemed to bother my mom. I could not even sit up. And I mean, the doctors really meant this. They said, you will never sit up. Now, this is important for two reasons. For the obvious reason, of course, of how I was able to overcome that, but I don't want you to think about that for a minute. Could you imagine, in this case, my mother's attitude? Emotions are a powerful thing, aren't they? Emotions are the one thing that can counteract positive attitude, right? Like, it's easy to have a positive attitude when everything's going well, correct? Not so easy when things are not going well. When I was first brought home, there was all of this wonderful love, all of these feelings about this poor child and caring for him and loving him and my responding. And you can imagine sympathy was a big emotion as well. I think sympathy is an emotion people react to when they see me, even as a 40-year-old man. I don't think many people see Alvin Law for the first time and go, hey, he's got no arms. Excellent. No, I don't think people do that. So you can imagine, as a baby, it was like add another dose of the sympathy, right? But I think if anyone in this audience, specifically or personally, has ever tended to the needs of a special needs child, you would know what it feels like. That sympathy starts to change. It becomes more personal. It becomes one where you almost feel guilty because you're getting tired, huh? You're getting emotionally drained. You're wishing that this child could do more, but you know they're not, and that's hard, isn't it? That's what my mom started to go through. Months were going by. I wasn't doing anything. She was getting particularly frustrated, which led to this wonderful story she loved to tell. One day she was trying to can tomatoes, and I was becoming a real pain, Every time she would put me down, I would start to cry. I was one of those babies, right? She was trying to can tomatoes and hold on to me. This wasn't working. So she had an idea. There was an empty cardboard box on the floor in the kitchen from the mason jars, right? She took my beloved baby blanket, she laid it in this empty box, she laid me in the box, and I guess I started to smile. At least I didn't cry. This was a first, huh? So my mom wasn't stupid. She started putting me in the box all the time. I mean, she didn't go on holidays or anything, but you understand? Now, why would I be even telling this story? Because, you see, one of the things that I find most intriguing, and this is just a personal observation, I mean nothing by this, but in the schools that I travel to extensively, there is a goal, and there's nothing wrong with this goal. And they tell young people, you should get straight A's. You should be the best. You should win things for your school. Win things.